Today we're diving into some pretty wild stuff. Donald Trump's first day back in the White House.
It's certainly been a busy one.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people are talking about these executive orders. Trust me, there's a lot to cover. He signed over 10 on just the first day. Everything from immigration and social policy to climate change. He even renamed some landmarks.
It's definitely a lot to process.
So, ready to take a deep dive?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, let's start with immigration.
Okay.
On his very first day back, Trump declares a national emergency at the southern border.
Right.
I remember this being a tactic during his first term as well. But what does this actually mean in practice? Like, what can he actually do by declaring a national emergency?
Well, you're right. It's not the first time we've seen this. When a president declares a national emergency, it allows him to bypass Congress, essentially, and redirect funds, often for military purposes or, things that he deems a national security risk. In this case, it's about border security, deploying troops, building barriers, and really ramping up enforcement.
And it's not just about those increased security measures, though, right? He's also calling for the largest deportation program ever.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty intense. Is there any historical precedent for that kind of action?
I mean, there have been periods of, heightened deportation activity in the past, but the scale of what he's talking about, what's being proposed, it does seem unprecedented. But of course, translating that rhetoric into actual policy, that's another matter entirely. And you can bet it'll face legal challenges along the way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Which brings us to another executive order that's creating a lot of controversy, the one targeting birthright citizenship. It seems like a pretty huge deal, right?
Oh, it's a massive deal. Yeah. It's a direct challenge to the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship to anyone born on U.S. soil. This is a fundamental principle of American law, and any attempt to alter it will almost certainly end up in a Supreme Court battle. I mean, think about it. This could impact generations of families, reshape the very fabric of American society.
Okay, so we can see immigration is definitely a top priority.
Without a doubt.
But it's not the only area where we see this sharp contrast with the previous administration, right? There's a whole other set of orders aimed at undoing, like rolling back what Biden put in place.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We're seeing a major shift, a really distinct shift in both social and environmental policy. One that immediately stands out is the order recognizing only two genders. This essentially reverses those Biden-era guidelines that acknowledge gender identity. And that has some pretty far-reaching implications, potentially affecting transgender individuals in healthcare, education, and even access to public facilities.
And on top of all that, he's revoking 78 of Biden's executive actions. A lot of those were related to racial equity and LGBTQ plus rights. Can you shed some light on what those actions were trying to achieve and what rolling them back could mean?
Sure. So broadly speaking, those actions were part of a larger push for diversity and inclusion across the board, within the federal government, in hiring practices, and in various social programs. So rolling them back could signal a significant shift in priorities. And we're definitely anticipating some pushback from advocacy groups who see these issues as, well, essential.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then, there's climate policy. You remember, of course, when the U.S. rejoined the Paris Agreement under Biden. Well, Trump has now withdrawn the U.S. from that agreement again. It's a pretty clear signal that he's taking a different approach to global environmental efforts.
Right. And it's not just the Paris Agreement either. He also revoked those electric vehicle targets that the Biden administration worked so hard to put into place. Can you remind us what the reasoning was behind those targets? What were they trying to do?
Yeah, so the main idea was to speed up the transition to, cleaner transportation. They did that by setting these ambitious targets for how many electric vehicles would be sold in the U.S. It was seen as like a really key step towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions and actually addressing climate change. But by reversing that, well, it really raises some questions about, how the U.S. plans to approach those challenges now.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've got immigration, social policy, climate change, and then there's this other batch of actions that feel a little bit more like power plays, almost like symbolic gestures, like the pardons for all those January 6th defendants.
Over 1,500 people. It's a lot. Legally, what it means is that their convictions related to the Capitol attack are wiped away. They're gone. But symbolically, yeah, it's definitely a move that's raising eyebrows and creating a lot of debate.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then there's the renaming of landmarks. Like the Gulf of Mexico is now officially the Gulf of America.
Right.
And Mount Denali back to being called Mount McKinley. Why even bother with that? It seems like, I don't know, just a strange thing to focus on. But I guess in a way, it's all about making a statement.
Absolutely. These might seem like small things, unimportant details, but they really speak to this, broader vision of like national identity. At least that's what Trump seems to be emphasizing. It's about symbolism and, controlling the narrative, even if it's through something as seemingly insignificant as a name.
And speaking of controlling the narrative, we can't forget about that National Energy Emergency Declaration. What's the real world impact of that, and how does it fit into all of this?
So this declaration is all about boosting fossil fuel production. Think, streamlining permits for drilling, pushing those pipeline projects through quicker, all that. It's probably going to be a big hit with the energy industry, but I'm sure we can expect some pushback from environmental groups, those who are worried about the environmental consequences of all that.
Okay, so lots of action on the domestic front. But Trump's also making some big moves on the international stage, too, like withdrawing from the World Health Organization. Didn't we already go through this during his first term? I feel like we did.
We did. This is another one where Trump is basically picking up right where he left off. He's been very vocal in his criticisms of the WHO, especially when it comes to how they handled the COVID-19 pandemic. He's accused them of, being too influenced by China, not being transparent enough. So this withdrawal, it lines up perfectly with his America First approach, putting U.S. interests first, even if that means taking a step back from global organizations or international cooperation.
It's interesting, right? It's almost like he's trying to undo every single thing the previous administration did and then reassert his own, vision for the country, even if it means kind of going against international norms or agreements that were already in place.
That's a great point, and it really underscores how significant these executive orders actually are. It's not just policy, it's about sending a very clear message, a message about the direction he wants to take the country in.
Okay, so to recap, we've got immigration crackdowns, social policy reversals, environmental rollbacks, pardons for, those involved in the January 6th attack, all sorts of symbolic gestures, and a whole lot of international shakeups. It's a lot to take in.
It really is, and it brings up so many questions, like what do all these actions tell us about Trump's priorities for this term? Is he doubling down on his agenda from his first time in office, or are we seeing some kind of new direction emerge? And maybe the most important question is, what are the long-term consequences of all this? How will this play out?
Yeah, big questions. But honestly, what gets me the most is just the sheer scope of it all. It's audacious. It feels like he's trying to completely reshape the country overnight.
I think that's a very valid point. It's a bold strategy, no doubt. And it's a risky one, too. But one thing's for sure, it definitely sets the stage for what's likely to be a pretty turbulent and maybe even transformative period in American politics.
It definitely feels like we're in for a wild ride. But before we get too carried away with speculation, I think it's important to remind everyone that we're here to, analyze the facts, to look at the potential impact of these executive orders. We're not here to tell you what to think.
Exactly. We really encourage you to consider all the different perspectives, do your own research, form your own conclusions. That's what makes all this so fascinating. It's about having thoughtful discussions and, using critical thinking.
For sure. It's about empowering you, the listener, to navigate this complex landscape
Yeah.
and make informed decisions about, the things that matter to you. So with that in mind, let's dig a little deeper into some of these executive orders. Let's look at some specific examples and see what the potential consequences might be.
Yeah, let's start with the immigration measures. I mean, increasing border security and deportations, that might appeal to a certain segment of the population. But there are also a lot of concerns about potential human rights violations and the economic impact. I mean, for example, a lot of industries really rely on immigrant labor. So, a mass deportation program that could have a huge ripple effect throughout the entire economy.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it highlights just how important it is to look beyond the headlines,
Okay.
to really think about the unintended consequences of actions like this. And when we look at social policy, well, rolling back those protections for LGBTQ plus individuals and the reversals of efforts to promote racial equity, I mean, that could have a profound impact on those marginalized communities. It's about access to things like healthcare, education, job opportunities. the very things that contribute to a just and equitable society.
You're absolutely right. And we can't forget about the environmental piece of all this either. Withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, rolling back those electric vehicle targets, I mean, it sends a pretty clear message about where this administration stands on climate change. And it raises concerns about the U.S.'s commitment to addressing this global crisis and their willingness to work with other nations to find solutions.
Yeah, it's like taking a step back from that global stage and choosing, I don't know, short-term gains over long-term sustainability. And this focus on boosting fossil fuel production, I mean, that could have some major environmental consequences, maybe even exacerbate climate change and put those most vulnerable communities at even greater risk.
It's all connected, isn't it? The decisions made in one area have this ripple effect that touches everything else. And that's why it's so important to talk about these things, to examine these issues from all sides, and really engage in critical thinking.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the nuances, the complexity, the potential consequences of everything. So as you process all this information, we want you to ask yourself, what are the motivations behind these executive orders? Who stands to benefit from them? Who might be harmed? What are the long-term implications for the U.S. and really for the entire world?
Yeah, those are some tough questions, but those are the ones we need to be asking because ultimately it's about figuring out what kind of future we want, a future that is just equitable and sustainable for everyone.
Yeah, really well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot today, and hopefully you're feeling a bit more informed about what all these actions by Trump actually mean.
And as always, we want to encourage you to keep digging, explore different viewpoints, look at it from all sides, and come to your own conclusions. This is just the beginning of what is probably going to be a very interesting and probably pretty impactful presidency.
It definitely feels that way.
Yeah.
So much to think about, right? But before we go, I want to leave you with one last thought. We've seen Trump take some really bold and decisive action, right out of the gate. Whether you agree with his approach or not, one thing is clear. He is setting the stage for what could be a truly transformative period for American politics.
Yeah, the effects of these executive orders, they're going to ripple out across the country and really across the world, too. And it's a good reminder that politics isn't just something that, happens far away in Washington, D.C. It affects all of us, our daily lives. So stay engaged, stay informed, and let's keep talking about these things.
Well said. That's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for tuning in. And remember, the best way to really understand this crazy, complex world is to never stop asking questions and never stop learning. We'll be back soon with another deep dive, so until then, stay curious.